When we think about fascist movements in Europe, themes like racial hierarchy, eugenics, and hostility towards disabled individuals often come to mind. However, the realities of disability and fascism in Europe are far more complex. This month on Talking History, we will be discussing the topic of fascism and disability. To help us navigate this challenging subject, we are thrilled to be joined by Ms. Brandie Robb, a graduate student here at Missouri State University. And more importantly, from our perspective, she is currently conducting research that focuses on disability in fascist Italy and highlights the complex relationship between the fascist state and disabled people. I'm Djene Badgelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History.
Welcome, Brandie.
Thank you.
So what does the mainstream literature on fascism and disabled people tell us?
I've found two themes that are really common in mainstream literature on fascism and disability. And one theme always tries to connect fascist Italy with Nazi Germany. The other theme is completely the opposite and tries to distance the two. There's one book that's by Filippo Ficcardi, and it's actually titled The Bad German and the Good Italian. And it looks at stereotypes of the Second World War that basically created the accepted narrative of Germany did everything bad and Italy never did anything bad. So it actually challenges those stereotypes and tries to get somewhere back in the middle of what happened. There are also a lot of books that relate to the eugenics movement, which was instrumental in Germany in the negative aspect. Germany used eugenics to begin in the 1930s sterilizing individuals that were born with disabilities without their consent. And as World War II progressed, it moved to outright murder of hundreds of thousands of disabled individuals. Italy also had a eugenics program, but it's considered positive eugenics in that they didn't sterilize individuals. What they did was actually look at people who had what they thought were positive traits, good genetics, and encourage them to procreate and have lots and lots of children to fuel the fascist regime.
So your focus is looking specifically at Italy, and as you pointed out in your introduction there, often our image of disabled people in the First World War is, in the Second World War, is what happened in Germany, which is this very brutal eugenics, which of course was not unique to Germany at the time. The United States also sterilized disabled people who were criminals. This was not uncommon at the time, but Germany really takes it to that kind of next level when it's sort of doing this horrific things to people who are born with physical or mental disabilities. But your research in looking at fascist Italy, you actually highlight some important points and connections between sort of the rise of fascism and the role of disabled people in the rise of the fascist movement. Could you talk about what you're talking about there and how that is sort of different from the kind of eugenics version of the eugenics that motivated violence against disabled people? What's the difference? What's happening in Italy? How are the disabled playing a role in the rise of fascism?
When World War I ended, there were over 500,000 disabled Italians returning from the front lines. They could no longer support their families. They could no longer work in the same jobs they did. And at this time, there wasn't any centralized legislation to protect these people. So there was nowhere to go. They were angry because they had given their physical health for Italy, and they felt that Italy had a moral duty to support them. Mussolini himself suffered from injuries due to an artillery accident in the trenches, and he experienced going through the military hospitals and basically the disability experience at the time. This was also a really tumultuous time politically for Italy, and there were different groups vying for power in Italy. So disabled war veterans use this to hold political protests and rallies, asking for pensions and asking for rehabilitation services, and reminding people of the debt they believed Italy owed them. So Mussolini saw this as a propaganda opportunity. These veterans were being treated really poorly by the Italian public and sometimes even being spat upon, being attacked by people. So Mussolini turned the narrative and basically used it towards his nationalist narrative for propaganda and ended up getting more people to join the fascist regime and the fascist cause because of this.
So Mussolini basically, there was this large group of disabled people who had been disabled. They were not born disabled.
Right.
But they had served their country during the First World War, fought in the battles against Austria and against other neighboring countries. They come back to an Italy that doesn't appreciate them. And not only that, they're disabled. There's no services or anything like that. So Mussolini is able to kind of shift public opinion on this and turn them into people, instead of people that people are looking down on, but people who he is telling the Italian public that they should feel responsibility towards.
He is. He uses them to legitimize his own movement. He zeroes in on the events and protects the disabled veterans, and he emphasizes their service in the war and the fact that they became physically disabled because of the call to serve Italy. And by doing this and by placing photographs in newspapers, newspaper articles in his newspaper, he was able to shift public opinion that the disabled servicemen should be respected and helped rather than spat upon and attacked.
So beyond a shift in sentiment, was there did the Italian state actually move to help these people materially, or?
They did with the influence in the shift with propaganda. The state organized a centralized committee, and because the majority of these men made up the economic workhorse of Italy, they needed these men to return to work. They could not just stay home forever. So they organized a pension that took care of the men. They also went through occupational rehabilitation, and if they could no longer perform the job they performed prior to their wounding, they trained them in another activity. So if they were a farmer beforehand, they could no longer farm. They could become a shoemaker. They could become a teacher. They could become a storekeeper, something so they could still contribute to the economic power of Italy.
And did this happen before Mussolini came to power, or was this a policy adopted by the fascist government?
This is actually something that happened right as Mussolini was coming to power.
So the state is already moving to take care of
Yes.
these veterans. So what happens when Mussolini gets to power?
The same thing. Things keep going. There are veterans organizations that highlight what's going on with the veterans. There's more propaganda, and the veterans end up getting more recognition. They get wheelchair ramps built to their homes. Rome becomes wheelchair accessible. There are a lot of different events that are incorporated into Italian culture that weren't incorporated before Mussolini came to power.
That's fascinating that Rome was wheelchair accessible in the late 30s, is that?
Yes, there are photographs of apartment blocks that were built specifically for the disabled veterans that have wheelchair ramps and elevators, which was not common in Rome at all at the time.
I mean,
and it's really not common in Rome now as it is.
I mean, was anything like that going on do you know, is anything like that was going on globally at that time? I mean,
in the United States, they had started with a little bit of accessibility, but in Europe, it was very uncommon at the time.
Interesting.
So basically, fascist Italy was kind of at the forefront of, trying to meet the needs of a certain group of disabled people.
Yes, and in addition to the disabled servicemen, they also created pensions for war orphans and war widows, which was really uncommon at the time as well.
So you have this big social program, social program that we might usually associate, let's say, with the liberal left or even something that's very modern. Like people act as if, disability is something that appeared, in 1975. And, suddenly now we have to accommodate all these disabled people. But your research is showing that actually fascist Italy was taking this very seriously in the 1920s and 30s.
Yes.
So Djene hinted at this, I think, earlier, but your research makes an important distinction between these veterans who sustained injury during war and as a result had some sort of disability versus those people who may have been born or developed a disability outside of the context of World War I. In what ways were these people treated differently by the fascist state and the public?
Disability at the time wasn't really an all-encompassing demographic. So individuals who sustained injuries due to war were still basically mentally competent. They could perform jobs. They could contribute to Italy's economic welfare. Basically, they could still conform to normative Italian culture. Individuals with intellectual disabilities or congenitally disabilities were very, very different, as they typically couldn't conform to Italian culture. So these individuals were usually sent to institutions to live away from society, or they were confined to their homes where they weren't included in Italian society. Usually, if a disability was intellectual, it was viewed in a really medicalized sense. It wasn't viewed in a way where someone could improve. These people, they were almost stripped of their humanity since they were looked at as medical subjects rather than human beings. And since these individuals were also considered socially undesirable by the fascist regime, they were hidden away and forgotten about.
So the serviceman can be redeemed in the eyes of the public and is useful as a propaganda tool, whereas someone who is maybe perhaps born without sight has no use to the regime, and so there is no.
It's interesting the way they looked at it. There were a lot of blind servicemen and a lot of hearing impaired servicemen that were reintegrated into society without problems. But an individual with Down syndrome or cerebral palsy that weren't able to contribute and weren't able to be redeemed and might not have been considered as photogenic as a disabled Italian serviceman with his uniform full of medals on was treated very, very differently.
And, how did the situation of those with congenital disabilities, the intellectual disabilities, how did this develop over the kind of long durée of the fascist regime in Italy? I mean, the fascists come to power in the early 1920s, a decade before the rise of Nazi Germany. What happened to these people? You mentioned they're taken away to institutions. What are these institutions like? How do they develop it? And how does the war that breaks out affect these institutions?
There really wasn't any centralized plan to deal with individuals with intellectual disabilities or congenital disabilities. So they were typically taken someplace like San Servolo in Venice. It's an institution that's on an island off the coast of Venice. It's completely isolated from the remainder of Venice, so no one ever even saw these people generally. And typically, since there was no centralized organization that was taking care of these institutions, they were administered by either the Catholic Church or charity organizations. And since they were administered by these organizations, that also meant there was no oversight. So the conditions inside the institutions changed dramatically from institution to institution. There were institutions that filled the place with wonderful, benevolent, caring caregivers that treated their individuals like family. And there were other institutions that would withhold food as punishment. They would withhold medical treatment. They would withhold sanitation from the individuals. So it was a horrible atmosphere to be in. And with no oversight, there was no one to come in and check the facility to make sure what they were doing was correct for the individuals. Also, the fascist ideologies, they identified these individuals as being socially undesirable. And the Italian psychiatric professionals that also worked in the institutions, they agreed with this assessment. So they really didn't do anything to help. So the conditions remained the same throughout the fascist period until the World War II period, when the food supplies, medical supplies were all diverted to go to the Italian front. So the Italian home front began lacking for food. So the last place that food supplies were sent were to the institutions where the individuals were socially undesirable or they were considered useless. So during that time period, thousands of Italians starved to death and also died from illnesses that would have been able to be taken care of with medical supplies, with penicillin, antibiotic treatment, and also from the lack of sanitation.
How about veterans? Did the war affect wounded veterans in the same way? Were they cast aside by the fascist state, or did the fascist state continue to support them throughout the war?
The fascist state continued to support them throughout the war. During the time period, the pensions and the support were never really considered to be something that was lifelong, since the veterans were supposed to be retrained to reintegrate into society. But veterans who were horribly disfigured or horribly disabled and never able to rejoin the workforce were cared for by the fascist regime throughout the war.
So there was this is a very, there was a kind of important distinction for the fascists between the deserving disabled and the undeserving disabled.
Exactly. Nazi Germany had a saying for disabled individuals, which this encompassed all disabled individuals, that was called life unworthy of life. They believed these people were useless feeders that took food from other places. And in Italy, it appears that physically disabled individuals, especially those who served in the military for Italy, were really in high esteem. They were taken care of very well. They were given apartments that were accessible for them. They were given pensions. But individuals with intellectual disabilities who didn't function on the same level as normative society were cast aside and deemed unworthy, almost like that life unworthy of life statement.
So as a kind of final question, this is an extremely fascinating topic that you're researching into. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of sources that you're using, and perhaps conclude by telling us about what got you interested in this topic as a graduate student studying history?
Well, I plan to travel to Rome over Christmas and do research in the state archives that hold a lot of the fascist documents. I've also found some wonderful archives that contain World War II documents, World War I documents, and there is an organization of war invalids in Italy that began in 1917 that has a wonderful online archive that contains photographs, letters, diaries, and that's been very, very helpful in my research. The reason that I got started in disability research is that my son was born with Down syndrome. He's 23 now. And we traveled to Italy in 2022. I was lucky enough to be included on an archaeological field school that explored Roman sanitation and plumbing in Pompeii. So I looked at toilets for 6 weeks in Pompeii. But I was amazed at how Italian culture interacted with my son. And I wanted to find out why there was such a difference in how that culture came to be.
How did they interact with him?
It was interesting, especially doing the research on fascist Italy and seeing how individuals with intellectual disabilities were treated and how individuals with intellectual disabilities were treated in 2022. And it was completely different because even though Pompeii was not as physically navigable as the U.S. is. It didn't have a lot of wheelchair ramps and things like that. Socially, everyone was very inclusive and very accepting of my son. And it was really, really interesting because it seemed like everyone jumped in to help. Everyone jumped in to do what they could for one another and help make Italy as inclusive as it could be. And that was really a wonderful place to be.
That's an interesting and nice personal touch to your research that I think it's interesting to hear why someone is interested in something, and it's for it to be so personal is thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us for Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. Catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. This show is available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.